NATO's missile defense system is now entering its final construction phase, and they will be placing more defense sites in allied nations to augmentate the Aegis sea-based missile defense system, much to the dismay of nations like Russia and China. And to be honest, I agree with this move. Today's video is going to be a rant I've been wanting to do for a while, and the topic will be about nuclear weapons. Not about the specifics or science behind it, but its most intense moment when they're used. Over time, the power of and practicality of nukes has improved, which bring about newly debated topics. Before I get into the main one, let's just go over the history of nuclear weapons. The US was the first nation to develop them in 1945 and is the only nation to have used them in combat. It was only after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the large-scale debate began, and it even prompted its creator, Robert Oppenheimer, to give the famous speech,
"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
The Soviet Union followed with its own nuclear test in 1949, the UK then followed in 1957, France went after them in 1960, and then China obtained them in 1964. By this time, people actually came to terms with the fact that so many nukes were made to the point where the Earth would be rendered uninhabitable in case a war broke out. The military term for that is mutually assured destruction, or MAD as its acronym ironically goes. In order to combat this, the UN drafted the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and it went into effect in 1970 with almost all nations agreeing to it. This states that if your nation doesn't have nuclear weapons, you will not develop them. However, 3 nations didn't sign the treaty, and you can guess what followed. Israel has never confirmed nor denied having nuclear weapons, but it is widely believed that they have had them since the 1960s. India developed its first nuclear weapon in 1964. South Africa developed fission bombs in the late 1970s, but never tested them and dismantled the project the same year, although there is some speculation that the Vela incident may have been a South African nuclear test, but we have no proof for this claim. And Pakistan surprised the world with its first nuclear missile in 1998. North Korea is the only nation to have withdrawn from the NPT and developed its first nuclear missile in 2006. And it's worth mentioning that there are nations who have tried to get them. There have been nuclear programs in Brazil, in Argentina, in Libya, Taiwan, etc. But the point of this history lesson is to explain the fact that people are aware of mutually assured destruction with these weapons and have built a policy around it called nuclear deterrence. The strategy goes by the logic that if one nation strikes first, the other will retaliate with their nuclear arsenal and cause the destruction of both sides. This knowledge would stop any conflict from arising in the first place. Nuclear deterrence gained popularity throughout the Cold War, with one example being political scientist Kenneth Waltz, who argued that the threat of mutually assured destruction would force 2 sides to bring a peaceful solution to any crisis, therefore stopping an armed conflict from even happening. Multiple books have also been written which point out the nuclear weapons and their goodness because they will preserve peace throughout the world. And as some people have even gone as far as saying that every nation should have nuclear weapons because world peace would then be preserved through the nuclear deterrence theory. But the purpose of this video is to explain why this policy is flawed, and I am not the only one who agrees here. Multiple figures have criticized nuclear deterrence, such as former President Ronald Reagan, who called the policy a suicide pact. But criticism of mutually assured destruction had even come from certain figures in the 1960s. One iconic one was John F. Kennedy. He stated that nuclear deterrence would fail because they are dependent on many challengeable assumptions. The main 4 are the possibility of eliminating a second strike, miscalculation, madness, or accident. We're going to talk about each of these and poke large holes in the deterrence strategy. In order for mutually assured destruction to be achieved, an opponent must be able to retaliate with their own nuclear arsenal, but there are ways an enemy can take that possibility out of the equation by stopping a retaliatory launch. For example, let's say Nation A were to discover all the nuclear silos that belong to Nation B. From then on, they can just launch a preemptive strike to render Nation B's silos inoperable to the point where they cannot retaliate and mutually assured destruction isn't guaranteed. Another way of looking at this is the attribution of nuclear weapons. Let's say a nuclear missile was launched at North America or Europe from the Sino-Russian border. From there, it could be hard to determine who launched the missile. So what do you do then? Are you going to start risking a war with the wrong nation, or are you going to go to war with both nations? Another way of looking at this is if an enemy were to smuggle a portable nuclear device into a nation with a nuclear suitcase and detonate it there. How will you then determine who attacked you when the attack came from within your own borders? But one of the stealthiest ways a second strike could be eliminated if one nation can stop the retaliatory attack altogether. A nuclear launch can only be ordered by the head of state, so if an enemy were to infiltrate your nation and indispose your heads of state with their immediate line of succession, then no one will exist in order to order a retaliatory strike, and by the time a succession has been passed, your nation will already be destroyed by your enemy's preemptive attack. This is called a decapitation strike. These scenarios sound scary? Well, we're just getting started. Now we're going to our other reason. The doctrine of nuclear peace naturally requires perfect detection. It must be an absolute guarantee that there are no false positives in the equipment which must identify a launch by other side. Naturally, this isn't the case. Technology is just like a person, and it can make mistakes where Nation A could think they're being attacked and launch a first strike, which would then lead to mutually assured destruction. During the Cold War, this was the case on a lot of occasions. The most famous one was that of Stanislav Petrov. On September 26, 1983, the nuclear early warning system of the Soviet Union reported the launch of a few US ICBMs. These missile attack warnings were felt to be false by Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and therefore he didn't report them. The decision is seen as having prevented a retaliatory NATO attack against NATO and then a nuclear war. Investigation of the satellite warning system later determined that the technology used had indeed malfunctioned. And this was just one instance. Back in the 1950s, when radar wasn't fully operational yet, a flock of Canadian geese were detected and thought to be Soviet bombers. The Royal Canadian Air Force and the United States Air Force immediately mobilized their aircraft for retaliation, but stood down after identifying the bogies. In 1960, radar equipment in Greenland mistakenly thought Soviet SLBMs were launched over the Barents Sea, but later clearly identified. In 1979, the Yom Kippur War became close to becoming a nuclear war when NORAD mistakenly identified several missile launches, only to be discovered last minute. In 1983, the Soviet Union mistakenly intercepted a message about a nuclear attack when in reality, NATO forces were taking part in Exercise Able Archer. But it is also worth noting that the nuclear close calls didn't stop and have taken place even today. You may not know about many of them, but here are examples of miscalculations occurring in recent times. On January 25, 1995, a Norwegian and American science team launched a Brandt sound missile to study the aurora lights. The Russians mistakenly thought this was a US nuclear Trident launch and activated their nuclear briefcase. Finally, just before the button was about to be pushed, Boris Yeltsin checked with the Russian early warning stations, which confirmed at the last minute that the missile wasn't heading for Russian territory. Later, it was confirmed that it wasn't even a military missile. This is the closest that we've ever come to a nuclear war because a briefcase had actually been activated. On October 23, 2010, a launch control center at Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming lost contact with 50 ICBMs, and initially personnel thought it was a cyber attack conducted by either China or Russia, but later discovered in an investigation which confirmed that the cause of the problem was a circuit card that wasn't properly installed during a routine maintenance. On Saturday, January 13th, 2018, a ballistic missile alert was issued throughout the emergency alert system about a North Korean launch at Hawaii. U.S. Pacific Command immediately looked into it to see what was going on, but only after 3 minutes had been notified by the Hawaiian National Guard that it was a false alarm. And let's note that 3 minutes is a lot of time when you take into account military planning. 38 minutes after the broadcast, the public was notified about the incident. The false alarm further pressured demilitarization of nuclear weapons between President Trump and Kim Jong-un and caused mass hysteria and panic over Hawaii.
All personnel take shelter immediately.
Just after 8 a.m. in Hawaii, pandemonium in paradise. Hysteria triggered by a false alarm. The terrifying message screamed across cell phones throughout the state. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill.
An accidental alert went out across Hawaii urging people to take shelter due to an incoming ballistic missile. The false alarm was eventually called off, but not before Hawaiians and tourists started scrambling, even saying their goodbyes.
Please report to the lobby to receive direction to the basement.
Desperate parents put their children into manholes. Terrified families huddled in closets. Others shared what they thought could be their final goodbyes.
I just wanted to know that I love you guys.
Oh gosh, what happened? Holy crap. Did something happen? Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Did you guys get that? Holy shit. Oh my god. What do we do? Did you get that, Cheryl? What do we do? Shit. Babe, what do we do?
Do what?
Did you not get that?
What is it?
There's an emergency ballistic missile threat.
What?
Not a drill.
What? No way.
Yes. What do we do? Tell me.
The list of close calls is too long for comfort. These are only cases that the US has declassified. Some countries like Russia or China simply don't even inform the public on most of their instances. It only shows how deterrence has fatal flaws in it. For nuclear deterrence to be successful, all heads of state must have perfect rationale. If one or more leaders came to the conclusion that nuclear war wasn't such a bad idea, then you virtually can't reason with them, and that extremist leader would welcome Armageddon by launching an unprovoked attack. It's actually scary to come to terms with that when our world has some questionable motives. Vladimir Putin has been in power since 1999. He is the longest Russian ruler since Stalin. You cannot run a powerful country that long and expect to remain normal. Russia is a country that is obsessed with not being embarrassed on the world stage. Putin has been in tune with this for a long time. If he is put into a tense situation and backs down, his political career will take a fatal blow, which is why he would be inclined to make rash decisions. And let's point out how two leaders here in the West aren't exactly the brightest of people. Then let's also mention the Chinese president, who is getting even more paranoid and is turning China into a police state and banning movies that he claims make fun of him. And don't even get me started about the man-child leading the world's most rogue nation. Another way of looking at this is how rogue commanders could corrupt the launch decision process. What if there was a coup and that new leader gets control of the nuclear arsenal? Or if a ballistic submarine or silo commander decides to start a nuclear attack without orders from the head of state? Such an incident nearly happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 27, 1962, the USS Randolph fired depth charges at B-59, a Soviet nuclear submarine, in an attempt to force it to surface. The submarine had dived below communication levels, and the crew didn't know whether a war had broken out or not. Without orders from Moscow, Captain Valentin Savitsky was ready to fire a nuclear warhead from the sub. The only reason why he didn't do so is because the B-59's executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to fire a nuclear weapon despite being ordered to do so. He then persuaded the captain to stand down, and after the submarine's batteries had run low and its air conditioning failed, the sub surfaced amid the pursuing American warships and set course back to the Soviet Union. Another way of looking at this is if a third country were to launch a nuclear missile and blame one or the other side for the attack, such as a terrorist or political extremist, this would then cause a nuclear war, and at the beginning, no one really intended for it to be that way. This only shows that politicians are humans too, and can also be driven mad by the stresses of their office. The difference between an accident and a miscalculation is that an accident would come from a malfunction in one's own nuclear device rather than an early warning detection malfunction. For example, on January 24, 1961, a US B-52 Stratofortress malfunctioned, which caused it to crash near Goldsboro, North Carolina. 2 4-megaton nuclear warheads were on board and dropped out. One of the nuclear bombs successfully landed with an open parachute. The other one, however, landed in a swamp with a thud after its parachute failed to open. 5 out of the 6 safety keys broke off. If that last one had broken off, there would have been a nuclear explosion. It would have been enough to make the US think that it was being attacked, and would then launch a false retaliatory attack against the most likely target, aka the Soviet Union. And there are many of these incidents too, ones that still remain a threat to this day. In 1950, a US bomber carrying a nuclear warhead off the Canadian west coast malfunctioned and dropped the bomb. To this day, it has never been found. If it were to explode today, it could be misrepresented as a first strike. On March 1956, a US bomber left MacDill Air Force Base in Florida en route to Europe and disappeared somewhere over the Mediterranean. It has never been found either. On December 5, 1965, an A-4E Skyhawk malfunctioned during takeoff from the USS Ticonderoga over the Pacific Ocean, and the nuclear bomb was never found. On May 22, 1968, the USS Scorpion disappeared with all of its nuclear missiles, and the wreck wasn't discovered until October of 1968. That leaves a 5-month gap where the warheads could have exploded and destroyed a ship in the waters above it. And don't think that the Americans are alone in their loss of nuclear weapons. On May 8, 1968, the Soviet submarine K-129 sunk in the Pacific Ocean, and its wreck wasn't lifted until 1974. Another Soviet submarine, the K-8, sank off the coast of Spain with all of its nuclear warheads. The K-219 sunk in the Atlantic Ocean with 34 nuclear warheads. The French submarine, the Minerve, sunk in the Mediterranean Sea, and it wasn't discovered until July 22nd, 2019. The Israeli submarine, the INS Dakar, sunk on January 25, 1968, with reported nuclear weapons on board, and it wasn't found until over a year later. There are too many incidents to count, and some have even happened in modern times, such as the time a nuclear-tipped Russian cruise missile exploded in 2017, to the time the United States Air Force misplaced a few nuclear weapons in 2007. These are all clear examples how no one can be trusted with nuclear weapons, especially when history has already proven that they won't bring world peace, as nuclear nations have confronted each other directly, only it never escalated to nuclear conflict. The Korean War saw direct confrontation between the US and USSR. The Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 saw combat between nuclear Russia and China. The Kargil War in 1999 saw fighting between India and Pakistan. And we are now currently in a new Cold War. where tensions with Russia, China, and North Korea are pretty high. Is there any guarantee that they won't escalate into nuclear confrontation should an armed conflict arise? That's why I support two initiatives. The first is indeed to support the idea of missile defense and cease all narrative about how it would shift the balance and disrupt peace, as if nuclear deterrence would be successful in doing so. That is why I support Reagan's idea.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
And the other initiative is to support complete demilitarization of nukes. One way is to detonate them in underground bunkers, and the other is to place them within nuclear waste in hardened bunkers several stories beneath the surface so they can die on their own after several thousand years. And I don't mean decrease the stockpile over time, but get rid of them all at once. That should be our intended goal. The only alternative is to live in the deterrence pipe dream and inevitably move closer to the day of our mutually assured destruction. By then, nukes will kill more people than deterrence has saved.